Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sovereignty with me, your host, Tatiana de Queiroz, your new bold voice for economic sovereignty. And what does sovereignty speak about? I'm going to deep dive into issues relating to the economy, to security, to defense, to innovation, to resilience. Ultimately, all those key topics and subjects which are making headlines and which impact sovereignty and our understanding of sovereignty and the different powers at play. So if you like bold, raw, hard-hitting content that reduces the complexities, make sure to like and subscribe, get the word across, press the like button on your screen, share this video if you think that it could interest everybody else. And you can also follow me on Twitter, the link is below, and subscribe to my newsletter where I'll be publishing not only exclusive content, but also exclusive written analysis on some of the key themes shaping the economy and economic sovereignty. So without further ado, today's episode, we're going to be going into big topics. US military contracts, AI, DeepSeek, of course, tech dominance, Switzerland, and the rise of mega, aka European federalism. So some of the things that you can expect today. I'll be talking about the Pentagon's bold, highly controversial move to halt all defense contracts in the pipeline for the next 10 days or perhaps for the next 90 days. And then we'll be moving on to DeepSeek and China's AI power play. And there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy over how a small startup can shake the foundations of big tech's large foundational AI models for about 100th of the price. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into China's innovation strategy and innovation culture, and specifically why DeepSeek is open source compared to its competitor. And on a related note, we're then going to move on to Switzerland. Yes, that's right. The US has halted exports of chips to Switzerland. Why? What does this mean for Swiss neutrality? What does it mean for Swiss research into AI? I mean, at the end of the day, they've actually announced this year a big 2025 AI strategy, and chips are at the very core. So I'll be exploring what Switzerland can do to counter this export ban. And finally, then we're going to move into European empire building, aka, as I said, make Europe great again, and why it's leading to a new wave of European federalism. What does a European empire mean in the 21st century? And what could potentially be the consequences of Make Europe Great Again? So enough with this preamble, and let's dive in. The first topic of the day is the US's and the Pentagon's bold gamble to pause army contracts. So yesterday, late last night, the US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, announced a very audacious decision. He was going to pause all new army contracts. So he's doing this in the context of a speech that he made last week to revive what he calls the US Army's warrior culture. In reality, it's a decision that could cost the US billions of dollars, whether it lasts 1 week, 10 days, or even 90 days, and could really raise concerns about the US military's capability to deliver and how it's going to be distributing its defense contracts. So what does this move really mean? For those of you who know me, let's break down the numbers a little bit to have more context into this decision. So in 2023, the US Department of Defense awarded more than $413 billion in US federal contracts through the Pentagon. So every day, this means that the Pentagon is awarding over $1 billion in new contracts. I mean, here we're going to presume that it's linear because we know that the Pentagon doesn't award every day 1.3 billion. But if we separate this by 365 days over the 2023 fiscal year, this is what it means. Now, let's imagine this. A 10-day halt would mean a little bit over 11.3 billion in delayed contracts in the pipeline not being awarded to US defense contractors. And as he hasn't given a time frame, a 90-day halt would mean nearly 102 billion stuck in the pipeline, not going anywhere. So these are not small numbers. This is actually the size of a small country's GDP over 90 days. And what's the risk here? What does it mean for US defense contractors? And I think this is where it's important that we segment between the very big ones, your Raytheons, Lockheed Martins, and your smaller players, startups, R&D contracts, the new emerging defense contractors we're increasingly seeing, such as Anduril, Shield AI. So, for example, Lockheed Martin, it's one of the largest contractors of F-35 jets and missile systems. 71% of its revenue is associated to US defense contracts. So here, I mean, you can imagine the delay this is going to create in some of the military contracts. Same thing with Raytheon. 68% of its contracts are awarded by the DoD, and this actually impacts beyond US borders, but of course impacts its NATO partners. General Dynamics, 80%, guys, 80% of its contracts come from the Pentagon, and General Dynamics is primarily a powerhouse in ships and military vehicles. So here's the caveat. It may be possible, because there aren't more detailed, that critical projects such as shipbuilding may not fall under this halt of contracts. And then Boeing, my God, where to start with Boeing? Here I've outlined the top 4 large incumbent defense contractors. But Boeing, we're looking here at 50% of its revenue tied to Pentagon contracts. And finally, Boeing. This is already a stricken company. And of course, it operates in a number of different sectors, but around 50% of Boeing's contracts are tied to the Pentagon. So you're looking at 4 incumbent companies where between 50 to 80% of their revenues are tied to Pentagon contracts. And the rumor has it that Hegseth wants to relook at diversity and inclusion clauses. So there's going to be a lot of changes within the clauses. People are still wondering whether this is going to impact already given contracts or just future contracts in the pipeline. But imagine the vast sums of money that this is involving. And this isn't hitting just large contractors, although we're going to see a lot of volatility on the stock market in coming days. But this is going to be particularly difficult for smaller players, such as defense subcontractors, R&D companies, and of course, startups. And if this goes on for quite some time, the whole US defense industrial complex could be facing major layoffs, budget squeezes, closures, loss of contracts, and even bankruptcies. So I have a lot of questions in terms of how, on one hand, the US, Hexaf Trump, is talking about strengthening the military industrial complex, and on the other hand, it is basically squeezing the military industrial complex. And this may be, and I think this is it, really to clean up the industry. And most certainly that means there's going to be a change in procurement contracts and the types of procurements. There's been a lot of discussion around this in recent months, but it's going to affect the US defense sector. So what does this mean specifically for smaller players, startups? And I'm going to include in this Anduril, Shield AI, and some of the well-known names, and of course, smaller subcontractors and R&D players, because the US, through specifically the DIU, has been increasing its R&D budget for smaller US players. What does this mean in terms of technologies such as artificial intelligence, hypersonic planes, which, by the way, by the time this is published, there should have been the first flight of a US hypersonic plane, and cybersecurity? And what does it mean in terms of funding the future of cutting-edge technologies for the US defense and, of course, its allies? So this is what could happen. If there's a halt in new contracts for smaller startups, this is going to place them in serious jeopardy, because without continued funding, they're going to be waiting on new contracts. We all know that the sales cycle and procurement cycle in defense is extremely long. So a lot of them could actually close or have to look at another industry avenue. There's going to be liquidity issues. There could be forced layoffs, especially for those smaller companies who are trying to position themselves and compete against larger US contractors. This is going to be very, very difficult. And it also leads to the question of what does this mean in terms of funding for future technologies, and what are going to be the new R&D principles under which the Pentagon is going to operate. So there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of unknowns, but I'm also very curious about the economic implications of this decision and what does it mean. So, of course, there's going to be supply chain disruptions, and any delay in contracts is going to have a ripple effect across the whole of the US economy, and any vertical which is either strongly tied or even moderately tied to the US defense industrial complex. And it's going to create more critical delays, probably for things such as munitions and some critical projects. As I said, there's still a question mark over shipbuilding and some larger projects, but regardless, it's going to cause really critical delays. There's also going to be job losses. Whether this happens over 10 days or 90 days or 60 days, changes in procurement and in guidelines is going to create job losses, especially if contracts are delayed. And the biggest layoffs will probably be in the states of Texas, California, Virginia, who are all very strongly tied to the US industrial military complex. Stock market volatility is another one. So we've seen it over the weekend with DeepSeek. We've seen how US giants within the semiconductor space saw their stocks plunge. And we're probably going to see this now with some of the large defense incumbents, because there's going to be quite a bit of uncertainty, which means that people are going to hedge against the contracts. And this, of course, is going to affect, in the short term, in the very least, corporate profits, but also for Americans, 401ks, which are tied to defense stocks. So this actually may have a ripple effect also on consumers. But what is most interesting may be the potential. And here I am really doing a forward-thinking analysis. What could be the political fallout of this decision for the US administration, and especially for defense-heavy states such as Alabama, Connecticut, Arizona, where all of the major companies and defense incumbents are major employers. And we're not even going to get into Anduril's recent 5 million square meters investment in its new manufacturing facility. So this could potentially create quite a little bit of backlash within the Washington corridors. This could create a little bit of a clash between, the tech oligarchs, between the military, between contractors. So there's a lot of unknowns. I find that it's maybe a necessary decision to make the critical changes that a lot of the business sector and the more innovation-oriented players in the defense tech space have been talking about. But simultaneously, the lack of a very defined timeline is going to create uncertainty. And it's going to have an economic ripple effect, both on employment, on supply chains, and on the stock market. So this is going to be a little bit of a wait and see. I personally don't think that it's going to last 90 days. Don't take my word on it, but I don't think that it's going to last more than 30 days because the shocks are going to be too big. But we can expect quite a few announcements in the coming weeks over new laws and executive orders over procurement, and probably a significant overhaul of the Pentagon to become much more innovation driven, because I think this is the goal, to become much more innovation driven and to leave the space for smaller players to be able to compete against incumbents, because they're much faster, they can go to market much faster, and they do not have all of the production dilemmas associated with much larger players. So we're gonna see, and let's wait to find out. Now, on to l'ordre du jour. DeepSeek, China. The techno-economic race between the US and China, and frankly, how China and a small company, 200 employees, 6 million in funding, has, could we say, nearly toppled US big tech over the space of just a couple of days. And I'm not an AI specialist, don't pretend to be, but what I do know is innovation systems and how they work. And innovation systems, specifically state-led innovation systems in China, are very different to that of the US, even Western Europe. And therefore, the US have problems understanding how a small startup can disrupt billions invested into their large AI players. So what I want to do today is provide more context and analysis towards the difference between Chinese and state-led innovation, the US, and also why DeepSeek may be open source, because this is something that a lot of Western players do not understand. Why is DeepSeek open source? I mean, apart from, hosting and storing your data on Chinese servers, this isn't the point of today. Why make this project open source when we're restricting access to our AI models? So firstly, it's really important to understand China's innovation system. And this is characterized by long-term thinking, big national plans, which draw what the next 10, 15 years is going to look like in a specific industry, and a very high tolerance for failure, probably actually higher than in the US, and definitely higher than in Western Europe. And the Chinese innovation ecosystem is extremely resilient, extremely flexible, extremely adaptable, because in a way, so much money is thrown not at creating one big player who's going to have this winner take it all approach, but actually creating a host of smaller companies where one may be the disruptor. And this is one of the main difference. So here's a key question that we have to ask ourselves. Why is China, who has a very different political and economic model than the US, so willing to innovate and to fail in a way which is actually driving its success? And we're seeing this as a result of DeepSeek and numerous other technologies, versus the US. And this lies in open source. Actually, by making DeepSeek open source, it's a strategic move. It isn't about technology transfer. It's actually about creating credibility on the global scene and exerting much more credibility and influence over the capabilities of its technology. So it's a move for legitimacy, because 30 years ago, when we used to speak about China, we spoke about it as the world's factory. And people used to say, well, China steals IP, it steals innovation, it does it much more cheaply, but it doesn't do it better. And I think it's very clear that in recent years, in the last decade, this narrative has absolutely shifted. China not only does it cheaper, but it does it just as well. And in certain critical technologies, it's actually only 2 or 3 years behind. And before DeepSeek really came into the global scene, there was already discussions about China's AI sector only being 2 or 3 years behind the US. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of some Chinese experts, which I'm linking here, and thank you, by the way, because you've provided so much insight into this discussion, this really is a move for increased Chinese credibility. So if this is about global influence, what does it mean? Well, there's 2 views, as I said, about China. There's the alarmist view over how China is surpassing the US. And then there's the more passive view, which is China isn't as good as the US. And it's a very binary. Check out this tweet here, because this is probably one of the most insightful pieces of information you can get on the Western perception of China. And this has so much to do with Western perception. The West is extremely skeptical about Chinese technology, and by creating DeepSeek as an open source, as I said, this is in a way a self-defeating move towards proving its technological sovereignty. And it also shows that export controls and sanctions are backfiring. If you're interested in this topic, I actually wrote an article on my blog about sanction-driven innovation, so you may want to check it out. But the key question here is, by trying to contain China through economic sanctions, through restriction on chips, through export controls, I think one of the key questions that now we need to ask ourselves is this having an opposite effect? And this is actually driving self-sufficiency and innovation. And I'm of the school that it absolutely is. I'm not going to get into a deep dive on the impact of sanctions-driven innovation, but there has been a host of research which shows, by putting sanctions and by putting export controls specifically in industrialized countries, this actually does increase not only their manufacturing and production capabilities, but it increases innovation because it drives the creation of new alliances. It forces countries to create their own domestic critical technologies, and they need to create a localized version of their market. And this is a strategy which China is also going to be following increasingly over the next year or two by driving domestic demand. And I believe DeepSeek is a big part of this strategy. And this is the main difference now between US investments and innovation versus China, and what could actually lead to China surpassing the West, both in terms of speed, in terms of scalability, and in terms of efficiency. Actually, DeepSeek could be China's Trojan horse. Well, it is. It wasn't expected. So if we address two major perspectives that there is in the Western world about China. As I said, you've got alarmists who are going to say, this is it, this is the beginning of the end, China is taking over, and they're basically running away because they're scared of China's dominance. And then there's the other ones who are going to argue, well, DeepSeek isn't all that. And as I said, it's a little bit of a middle, but the West can't help then being very binary. It has a very binary perspective on things. China is one of them. I personally believe it's somewhere in the middle. DeepSeek is extremely impressive. I've used it. I'm extremely impressed by the way that it thinks. I actually think that it's much more effective in the way that it rationalizes than ChatGPT. But simultaneously, it isn't a breakthrough either. What it just shows is that you do not need to throw hundreds of billions to achieve something. And then, of course, you're going to get the dismissive crowd. And this is going to be an imperative if we're going to play on the fact that DeepSeek is open source to provide Chinese technology with legitimacy in the West. And there's going to be those specifically within big tech who are going to be extremely dismissive about it. Who are going to say, oh, this is just another copycat of Silicon Valley. But guess what also? There's a lot of innovations specifically which don't come from the Western world, which have become very big because they were copycats, but also because they were localized for the domestics market. And it's important to understand that China's innovation ecosystem is actually built on copycats and what's called low productivity innovation. And this may sound negative to a lot of Western commentators, but it isn't. It's a very deliberate strategy. It's a trial and error approach to innovation, where inefficiency, and as I said, failure, and the wasting of resources isn't seen as anything negative. Actually, on the contrary, China's willingness and ability to absorb those losses and potentially those failures is what roots its innovation and ecosystem and its long-term strategic thinking. And the upside is actually monumental, because you're not looking at investing tens of billions into one moonshot and you have all of your vested interests in one company or one technology, but actually you have capital which is deployed across numerous players, numerous technologies. You're absolutely fine with failure. And ultimately what happens, you have a champion, and DeepSeek isn't the only one. You have one champion which becomes an outlier. And this is exactly what's happened. But what we also need to consider is the human element. And this is a big point of differentiation. Why make it open source? And this is, again, one of the biggest cultural differences. It's because I believe, and check out this tweet, which provides the context, that Chinese engineers behind DeepSeek are doing this not only because they're showing that they're leading, but actually they want to create some reciprocity. And feedback is not only going to generate more users and more discussions, it's going to permit them to improve the model, but also there's a very strong cultural trait to want to help and deliver something which is impactful in the AI world. And US players don't really understand this. Why would Chinese engineers really devote themselves to helping and to creating feedback? So I believe the US and Western Europe need also to do a lot more reading on Chinese innovation culture, but also the human factors and the human elements which drive those decisions and which drive the wider strategic moves. And actually, maybe there would then be a little bit less of a divide, and this would be causing less debate. And frankly, we need to start paying more attention in the West, whether export controls and sanctions, I mean, they're there to flex muscles, they're there as a containment tool, but are they really working? Maybe another narrative should be called upon. So this is going to be my question to some of the alarmists among you, and there's quite a few. If China's system is so inefficient, why is it creating outliers? And if China's technology, specifically with DeepSeek, is so inferior to big tech, why is it being given away for free? So I think we need to look a little bit more into that. And what is harder to copy? The chips in themselves, or the culture of scalability, of resilience, of the diminishing of risk factors? And let's speak of investment here a little bit, because I hope that Swiss politicians and those who are negotiating take this into account. So I've run some numbers, and a 1 year lag in access to critical AI hardware could lead to a 20 to 30% productivity loss throughout the Swiss economy. And it could result at best in losses, direct losses of around 800 and 900 million, all the way up to 2 to 3 billion annually. Now, this doesn't seem like a big number, especially when fundamentally Switzerland isn't investing 500 billion in AI infrastructure. But when you're relating it towards the size of Switzerland's R&D industry in artificial intelligence, to the value of its licensing, to the value of its patents, which are one of Switzerland's largest intangible assets, this leads to direct monumental losses. And probably the most negative impact is going to be on the Swiss AI ecosystem and indirectly startups. Swiss AI startups have been attracted to quite a lot of venture capital funding. I believe 1.2 billion last year was invested in Swiss startups, and over a quarter of this was in artificial intelligence. And there are a lot of US investors coming to Switzerland, investing in Swiss AI startups, hardware, robotics, biomedical AI, because the valuations are much cheaper and the technologies and the patents are absolutely solid. And the losses this is going to generate for the wider Swiss AI ecosystem are going to be monumental. I mean, look, realistically, I wouldn't invest now as an investor in a Swiss AI startup under those conditions. So what's going to happen? There's already a huge brain drain of Swiss entrepreneurs in artificial intelligence. And why is that? There's plenty of early stage startup capital investing in AI, and then somewhere along the lines of Series A, US investors come in. And the Swiss market is fundamentally quite small. It also tends not to be hugely in the culture to have huge growth domestically. I mean, that isn't possible. So most AI entrepreneurs, if they want a US check, tend to re-domicile to the United States. This is nothing new, but with those export restrictions, this is going to drain entrepreneurs out of Switzerland. It's going to drain capital out of Switzerland, and research is going to go elsewhere. Spin-offs are going to be licensed elsewhere. Entrepreneurs are going to establish themselves in Germany, and most likely they're going to establish themselves directly in the US, where they have access to no export restrictions, but on top of that, contracts with big tech, because it's important to know that fundamentally most of those startups also don't become big tech giants. They become swallowed up by the big tech giants. They're much more service oriented in that approach. But the brain drain at university level is also going to be huge, because one of the key concessions that Switzerland is most likely going to have to make is with who it shares its research. So as I said, EPFL and ETH, which is actually ranked in the top 10 engineering and technology universities in the world, attracts a lot of foreign students. And yes, it attracts foreign students from China, from Korea, from Russia, and from countries which are seen as a risk. So ETH recently has already put in restrictions towards the provenance of students who can study a master's degree at the university, given the fact that most of the technologies it creates has potential dual use implications. So this is only going to extend itself. But the long-term impact is that these two bastions of Swiss research. These two bastions of positioning Switzerland globally really aren't going to attract foreign students anymore in the long term. And this is going to create an even bigger brain drain, because a significant proportion of these students are the ones creating research projects and are the ones creating patents. So the long-term consequences for Switzerland are actually quite vast and reputationally quite negative, because whatever happens, the damage has been done. So there can be negotiation and this export restrictions can be lifted, but without a clear stance on its neutrality, and regardless, even if there's going to be a clear stance on its neutrality, the reputational damage of Switzerland as a hub for not only AI, but technologies for open research is going to be greatly diminished, and therefore its access and attraction to other markets which aren't Europe and which aren't the United States. And of course, it's going to open the door to potentially restrictions down the line to other key technologies. And this is going to impact not only AI research, but as I said, robotics, hardware, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, all industries upon which Switzerland is heavily dependent on for its exports. And those losses, again, I did some calculations, they could equate to a minimum of 1.2, 1.3 billion annually. Directly within artificial intelligence, it could result in a loss of market share up to 10 to 15%. And foreign direct investments, this could be significant, because this is obviously going to have a spillover and network effect on other industries if there's a grain of uncertainty. So this may actually redefine Switzerland's global trading partners. And cumulatively, over time, over the next 12 to 24 months, if this stays in place, this could result in a GDP loss of approximately 2 to 3%. And Switzerland's GDP growth, like much of Europe, has been stagnant. So this would be absolutely hugely negative on the economy as a whole. As I said, Switzerland has been betting on its AI. So what can Switzerland do? And what do I think Monsieur Parmelin is probably doing now? So to mitigate those risks, it's absolutely clear Switzerland is going to try and negotiate. And most likely it's going to have to align to US export controls, not only within the wider field of artificial intelligence, but as I said, fields such as robotics, hardware, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, etc. This is going to substantially hamper its export balance of payments, but also its trade partners in the short and long run. And I mean, it's going to limit collaborations. And it's most probably going to be the start of a more forceful hand in Switzerland having to join US-led tech alliances and initiatives. So what does this mean? Purchasing primarily more from US big tech, and purchasing more from US companies and having much deeper ties with US companies across all facets, not only artificial intelligence, but in critical technologies. And finally, Switzerland is going to have to limit its re-exports to other countries. It's going to have to be extremely careful with its trade alliances. It's going to have negative repercussions on Switzerland's role and reputation as a neutral country globally. So the resulting factor is going to be an erosion of neutrality. Do I think it's going to be met with domestic resistance? Yes and no. Because there's already a very strong alignment within the artificial intelligence sector with US tech companies and with US investors. So there's actually going to be a very big push for certain concessions to be made, because otherwise, yes, there is going to be insurgency within Switzerland's entrepreneurial and investor class, and there's going to be huge economic trade-offs. So I do believe that a deal is going to eventually be made. I do not believe that Switzerland will be on export controls for a substantial amount of time, but it will be for a number of months, because clearly the negotiations which are going to have to take place are going to be very difficult and very heavy. And there's a lot of domestic politics which is going to come at play, which is going to give rise internally to a much wider debate within society on issues surrounding primarily neutrality and Switzerland's shifting role in the world and within this new race between China with Europe. So it's going to lead to fundamentally, I believe, a lot of existentialist questions, but this issue is going to be resolved. Guys, as you've probably seen, the lighting isn't as good. It's been getting dark whilst I've been filming, so please bear with me. For the next episodes, I'm going to get proper lighting. I've ordered a microphone, but as I said, this is raw, this is bold. It isn't meant to be perfect as much as I would like it at the beginning. So thank you for your support, and your continued support will allow me to make sure that as we progress, these episodes are going to get more and more professional and even better to look at. But now I'd like to go to my next and final segment of today's podcast. And this is European empire building and where we're at with this. And I'd like to start you off with a quote from Bruno Le Maire, the former Minister for Finance, Investment and Industry of France, and what he says in relationship to a European empire. Europe has a choice: nationalism or sovereignty. France chooses sovereignty, and I'll go even further. I think Europe has to become an empire again, a peaceful empire, in the words of Tocqueville, but an empire nonetheless. Between the American empire and the Chinese empire, Europe must assert itself as a peaceful empire. An empire has economic interests. An empire has ambitions. Our ambition must be to assert ourselves as the empire of human rights, the empire of rule of law, the empire of sustainable growth, capable of combating global warming. So this has been going around the X-sphere recently today, but this was actually written in 2019 in Bruno Le Maire's book, Le Nouvel Empire, l'Europe du XXIe siècle, which translates in English to The New Empire, Europe in the 21st Century, which let me know, guys, if you would like me to review it, because it's fundamentally a very relevant book, especially at the moment. But with all the discussions we've had over recent months, but specifically over recent weeks of Make Europe Great Again, there increasingly calls for building a European empire, European unity, European federalism, although most people don't seem to relate that mega is actually just a reworking and repackaging of European federalism, which was created by Alberto Spinelli in 1946. Today, I'm not going to go in depth into what are the cornerstones between the mega movements. I believe this really necessitates not only a separate episode, but I'd love to get expert commentary from people involved within the European federal movement and levels at the European Parliament to discuss this more. But I'd like to have a discussion around the premise of building a European empire and the shift from a fiscally led United Europe to a defense-oriented push. How this has been obviously amplified in recent years, and whether federalism could be the answer, and what does that mean in the 21st century? Because empires do not have positive connotations. So how are we shifting the narrative from something that had such negative connotations under 2 years ago to suddenly calling for a European empire? Is Bruno Le Maire's vision of an empire something which is achievable and realistic in an era of increasing geopolitical rivalry, populism, nationalism, and actually what would be the risks? If we're talking about a European empire, what would be the risks in terms of sovereignty and European identity and national identity? Would it strengthen disparities, or would it increase divisions? And I personally think that it would increase divisions. So let's provide a little bit of context here. What previously was seen as European sovereignty, and what are the cornerstones of Bruno Le Maire's and many others' arguments for European sovereignty and a European empire? So the first lies in the word sovereignty, and that includes reducing dependencies, geopolitical dependencies, resource dependencies, and technological dependencies. And this is very much at the heart of the European discourse today at absolutely all levels, be it at Brussels or be it at the level of individual member states and the general population. And previously, European unity was about economic integration, specifically fiscal integration, cohesive capital markets, which actually is going to be applied and was announced last week, completed banking union, and harmonized fiscal policies. And when Bruno Le Maire spoke about building Europe for the 21st century, he initially was speaking, specifically as finance minister, he was speaking about fiscal sovereignty. And today, specifically with Ukraine, this has shifted, the narrative has shifted from fiscal sovereignty to defense sovereignty as a link for unity. And this is incrementally different and provides a whole new layer to the debate. Technological independence is another. Independence in artificial intelligence, which I've spoken enough about today, cybersecurity, infrastructure, and of course, because it's Europe, regulation and restricting big tech players, specifically from the US, from creating monopolies in Europe and basically outcompeting European competitors. And now there's a whole discussion about the DSA policy. So Europe and Brussels specifically has been trying to achieve more technological independence through regulation And now people are calling for less regulation, a less regulated Europe. And two other cornerstones of sovereignty, circa 2019, of course, was green transition leadership and the Green Deal. Guys, I'm not going to talk about the Green Deal. I'll be attending an event at the EIB in a couple of weeks. The Green Deal is going to be integral. It always is as part of those discussions. I am firmly on the camp that the Green Deal, although great for the environment, does not allow Europe and European enterprises to compete in today's world, and even less so today. It's extremely restrictive. So I don't even want to get into it because I'm going to be honest, this subject bores me to death. And finally, the last two cornerstones of European sovereignty as we know it are its geopolitical strategy, which today is very much based around potentially creating a unified European defense, or at the very least, unified European funding for defense, and a cultural identity and unity. And this is probably the toughest, specifically when we're speaking about EU expansion and integration. And we can definitely see there's a move on both sides towards more nationalistic policies on one hand, and on the other, the call for more federalism. So why is federalism gaining momentum? Well, first of all, we have to thank Elon Musk, who has been an agent provocateur. I mean, even yesterday he tweeted that the British channel should be renamed the George Washington channel. I mean, I have no words at this stage. I watch in amusement, but we can't eliminate how influential he has been, first through MAGA, then bringing MEGA, which is absolutely a US import, to Europe. But why is there this trend where MEGA is gaining such ground, especially among political and intellectual and financial class, is that it's providing Europe with a basis in which to counterbalance global competition, specifically China, but also it's a response, although a very tardive one, to Brexit, to COVID, to the war in Ukraine, creating a collective consciousness which has been eroded over the last couple of decades in Europe. And Europe is suddenly waking up and seeing that it's dependent, that it requires independence, both geopolitically, technologically, that its supply chains are absolutely not resilient. Let's just look at the German automotive sector. And that there are threats to its global positioning. I mean, there's a rebalancing of the liberal world order. I think this is for another day, but the transatlantic alliance has absolutely shifted, and European leaders realize that. So by pushing for MEGA, it's not only promoting an agenda which aligns it in a way culturally much more with the United States, but it invokes this new consciousness over we need to redefine Europe, because Europe is going through an existential threat. And federalism, among a number of other movements, seems to be a potential solution for that. And I've been reading online quite a few threads about plans for United States of Europe. Fiscal union, defense reforms, political reforms, strategic autonomy, all grounded in eliminating the traditional national sovereignty and borders of Europe and promoting a new type of European federalism. Although we've been speaking much more about defense and trade than we have been about borders and immigration, although of course this remains key topics. And this is, in my opinion, quite concerning, because first is empire building in the 21st century really does have a negative connotation. There's no good way that we can speak about a European empire without bringing in centuries of unresolved empire building mistakes that Europe is culpable of. A peaceful empire, what is that? It doesn't mean anything. There isn't a single empire in history which has been peaceful. So if this is to create a new narrative, I think Europe needs to seriously go back to the drawing board, because realistically people are not going to be on board with this, even if it promotes unity and a sense of direction within a certain type of a population. This isn't going to work. And finally, how? Can somebody please explain to me, how can Europe, who is at the moment increasingly fragmented, who is increasingly isolated from the global arena, who has quite a lot of internal divisions by itself at the moment, how does a European empire, and please, Bruno, I'd love to invite you to speak more about this, how can we reconcile a European empire with national sovereignty and national and cultural identities? Because so far, this has been, I think, one of the failures of the European Union and the great European experiment. So this is definitely something that is going to be an ongoing topic. I just wanted to share some of my initial thoughts, what I was seeing, provide an analysis towards European empire building, and most probably try and nip it in the bud, because there needs to be a much bigger discussion of where this is coming from and what could potentially be the repercussions. I'm sure that Europe can unite and find its collective strength under a word with much less negative connotations. So guys, this is a wrap for today's episode of Sovereignty with me, Tatiana de Queiroz. Definitely it isn't going to be the last, because I had so much fun doing this. We explored the US halting its military contracts. We explored DeepSeek, Swiss export restrictions on AI chips, and we just touched the surface a little bit on mega European federalism, and specifically the use of building a European empire as a new narrative. And I would absolutely love to invite experts on this topic to come and contact me. I'd love to host you, because we need more pronounced discussion and debate and different viewpoints to explain some of the different themes and subjects which are going to be at play here in this podcast. But most importantly, I need your support. So hit the like button, subscribe to Twitter, subscribe to YouTube, share. And if you found this discussion thought-provoking, if it challenged you, if you learned anything, please share with your friends, with your colleagues, and become part of a growing community. Join my newsletter so that you can get exclusive content, so that you can get a first look at future episodes that I'll be recording and some exclusive episodes that I'll be recording only for community members, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you so much for joining me today on Sovereignty with Tatiana de Queiroz, the bold new voice for economic sovereignty.